Humans are certain about familiar patterns. We expect giant carnivores to look like monsters from murals. We expect long-necked herbivores to be gentle towers. We expect wings to be feathered and sails to belong to ships. Then the rocks open, and a fossil turns those patterns inside out. Strange teeth where a beak should be, feathers on a dinosaur that was supposed to be scaly, a paddle where a claw belongs. The strangest dinosaurs unsettle us not because they were loud or large, but because their bodies were clever in ways we did not predict. Each discovery asks a quiet question. What else did we miss while drawing simple pictures of a complicated world? The first case was a pair of forelimbs so enormous that they looked like a prank. In a desert where wind writes dunes into the same shapes over and over, workers pried from red sandstone, 2 arms longer than a person is tall, each tipped with scythes of bone as long as a kitchen knife. The animal they belonged to was Therizinosaurus, a creature that carried a pot-bellied torso, a long neck, a small head with a beak, and feathers that covered its body like a shaggy coat. Those blades were not butcher tools for tearing. They were slow rakes for pulling branches and for defending a bulky frame. Imagine a giant ground sloth that is also a feathered dinosaur with a bird-like pelvis. And you get close to the mood of this strange herbivore perched within a theropod family tree that also holds hunters. The shock was not only the claws. It was the lesson that form follows food, and that a branch of relatives known for speed and teeth had room for a slow-moving browser with a gut, like a fermentation vat. The next discovery turned the mystery up a notch. In a floodplain of ancient rivers, a skeleton lay with the torso of a canoe and the tail of a crocodile. Spinosaurus had been famous for a back sail tall as a room and a skull like a long, narrow trap full of conical teeth. For decades we pictured it as a land predator strolling between palms. Then new bones showed hind limbs shorter than expected and a tail built from tall, flexible blades. The physics changed with those bones. A body that broad and low, with hind legs that short and a tail like a fin, reads like an animal at home in shallows, marshes, and channels. The jaws hold pressure sensors like those of modern crocodiles, ready to feel the wiggle of fish. The sail and the tail likely moved water rather than air, and the long snout did not bite through bone so much as clamp slippery prey. A dinosaur that hunted like a heron the size of a bus is odd in any age. Yet if you stand by a river and watch the different ways living animals earn their meals, a semi-aquatic giant no longer feels outlandish. It feels inevitable. If those two cases made the world feel wider, the next ones pulled the ground out from under our feet. In fine lake beds of northeastern China, slabs split to reveal small dinosaurs dressed in structures that looked like a dare. Yichi and Ambopteryx were little tree dwellers with simple feathers on the body, but their forelimbs carried a long rod of bone that stretched the skin into a membrane. Not feathers for flight, but a bat-like sheet for gliding. These animals lived in forests that held other small flyers with true feathered wings, and still others with 4 wings, meaning long feathers on both arms and legs. The forest canopy was crowded with different flying methods, like a sky filled with gliders, kites, and small planes all at once. Yichi looked improbable until it did not. In a fossil community rich enough, evolution throws many ideas at the air and keeps the ones that work long enough to leave fossils. The idea that dinosaurs and birds experimented with membranes as well as feathers felt like a rule breaker until we remembered that rules are descriptions, not laws. Some strangeness hides in the small head at the end of a long neck. Nigersaurus arrived as a modest sauropod in size, but its face stopped traffic. The snout was wide and squared off, with the tooth row pushed to the very front like a vacuum cleaner nozzle. Hundreds of narrow teeth were stacked in batteries that replaced worn edges fast. Imagine grazing on low ferns, horsetails, and soft plants as you sweep forward with that squared face. A living lawn trimmer with a backbone that carried air sacs to lighten its steps. The skull roof was thin, the eye sockets wide, the neck flexible. Nigersaurus forced us to admit that the giants of the Jurassic had descendants in the Cretaceous that did not simply copy older designs. They remodeled the head to mow quietly near the ground, while heavier cousins tore at high branches. It looks comic in drawings, and perfectly sensible in a world where every height in a forest is a niche. Headgear became another stage for surprise. Parasaurolophus wore a long tube that arched back from the skull like a folded horn. For years it invited speculation. Was it for display, for smelling, for cooling? Evidence grew for a musical life. The tube connects to the nose passages, and the whole system looks like an instrument built into bone and air. A call sent down those tubes would carry across floodplain herds, a low rolling note, individual by shape and age. Corythosaurus and Lambeosaurus carried different crests, different resonant spaces. The idea is not a guess in a vacuum. Modern animals use head shapes to make sound. The most bizarre-looking crest becomes an ordinary social tool once you imagine a rainy season full of voices saying, "I am here, this is my group, come this way." There is an order behind the strange. Where there is headgear, there is also armor and camouflage, and here the surprises turn from spectacle to subtlety. An armored ankylosaur named Borealopelta died in a river and was buried so fast that skin outlines and armor placement survived. Chemical tests on its skin preserved pigments that read like a paint recipe for countershading, darker above, lighter below. A giant tank with a tail club still used shading to break its outline, because even tanks do not want to draw attention. Consider that image. A heavy herbivore with bony plates, spikes, and a sledge at the end of the tail still plays the soft game of light. The world was full of looks and glances, not only charges. Strange is a matter of context. What looks like overkill on a museum mount becomes normal in a world where large predators and thorny plants and open land made every hour a negotiation. Teeth and jaws carry their own stories, and some are quietly astonishing. Pegomastax was small, about the size of a house cat, with a parrot-like beak and small fangs at the front. Its teeth behind were leaf-shaped, ready to slice plants. The little fangs likely plucked and nipped fruit and leaves, and perhaps flashed in defense. It wore bristles on its back like a porcupine that forgot most of its quills. Not a monster, not a clown, but a tiny browser with a face that a toy maker would invent and a fossil bed kindly kept. Masiakasaurus, in another corner of the world, carried forward pointing teeth in the front of the jaws. The strange orientation makes sense if you scoop fish and soft-bodied animals from water edges or along a shore. A quick jab to catch, a swallow rather than a tear. These odd mouths remind us that the food web has many jobs beyond bite and run. Arms tell another tale. Carnotaurus showed us a skull full of horns and a body built for speed, but then its arms turned out to be stubs with odd wrists and reduced fingers. Mononychus pushed that reduction to the point of a single stout claw on each tiny forelimb, a tool built for digging into insect nests rather than grasping. The strangest arms can signal an entire shift in behavior. The animal did not need to hold prey with hands if the jaws did the work, or if its food sat in the ground and resisted only by being hidden. We should resist a simple ranking of arms as good or bad. Form answers need. Need can be a narrow bore that rewards specialization. The strangest limb is a clean letter from a life written in short lines we are only now able to read. The water returned to unsettle us again in a smaller and more elegant body. Halscaraptor wore a delicate skull, a neck like a swan, long fingers, and a tail with a paddle of stiff feathers. The bones in its forelimbs show features that help modern animals sweep water. The snout carries openings set in a way that hints at pressure sensing. Here was a small predator that likely swam and waded, foraged in shallows, and walked on land with equal ease. A dinosaur that looked like it was deciding between bird and otter before either word existed. When you add this to Spinosaurus and to trackways of other theropods in shoreline mud, the image of dinosaurs as land-bound begins to fray. The world was a braided set of beaches, bars, and bays that invited mixed habits. Feathers, the most surprising inheritance of this family, began to fill the record on both sides of the dinosaur family tree. Microraptor carried long feathers on its arms and legs, a four-winged plan that turned forests into gliding courses. Culindodromeus, an early ornithischian, preserved filaments and compound feather-like structures on skin that was not supposed to carry such things under old views. Ornithomimus and other ostrich-like dinosaurs show fuzz and even wing-like forelimb feathers in adults, perhaps for display and brooding rather than flight. When a field changes as fast as this one did, the strangest thing is our memory of certainty. Scales and feathers did not belong to separate worlds. They shared one riverbank. Skulls and senses remind us that the odd can hide inside. Shuvuya had enormous eye sockets and inner ears tuned to find prey at night in darkness. The hands were small, the legs built for running, the face slight, the whole animal light and shy by day, transformed by night into a tracker that heard and saw what the desert hid. Smallness makes room for strangeness, because it allows precision. A giant animal cannot rely on sound alone to find a beetle. A small one can, and it can design its head around that trick. The dinosaur world did not end at noon. Nights were busy, and some of the strangest bodies were built for hours we seldom picture. Sails and humps, which feel extravagant in paintings, turn sober when bones keep telling the same story from different places. Orinosaurus carried tall neural spines along the back and hips. Concavenator wore a high point on the back with a dip behind, a shape that looked like a little dorsal step. These structures could support fatty tissue as storage and as display. They could regulate temperature. We can argue about the ratio, but the mix is likely. A body is a negotiation between physics and courtship. The strangest outline can be a quiet compromise between the need to be seen by your own and the need to survive a week without a meal. Among sauropods, which seem on first glance to be variations on a long-necked theme, there were necks that turned the sky into sculpture. Amargasaurus and Bajadasaurus wore pairs of long spines along the neck, perhaps sheathed in skin to make sails, perhaps standing free as spikes. The spines could warn, they could carry keratin and appear larger. They could advertise to a mate that this neck belongs to a healthy bearer. The oddity is also vulnerable. A long spine will not regrow quickly if broken. These animals must have lived in landscapes where the cost of such spines was paid back in attention or defense. When a form looks risky, look for a payoff written in interactions rather than in bone alone. Eggs and nests changed how we see behavior, and some of the strangest dinosaurs were the most tender. Oviraptor sat over nests with arms outspread, covering eggs with feathers like a brooding bird. Psittacipodi preserved the same posture. Eggs laid in rings, shells that show pores tuned to different moisture levels in different sands, young that stayed in nests. All this fits a world where the odd crests and tail fans look striking not only to us but to mates and neighbors. A nest is a stage. A crest is also a conversation. Color, which we assumed was lost forever, returned in hints. Microscopic bodies and some feathers correspond to pigments in living birds. Patterns in a small theropod called Anchiornis were mapped to show dark and light patches. Borealopelta gave a chemical map for earthly tones. Psittacosaurus shows shading along the flanks that breaks outline as in modern deer. The strangest colors were probably normal to eyes that carried cones tuned to other ranges than ours. Insects, plants, and light all meet on a body. A striped tail or a shaded flank is a quiet weapon that leaves no slash and bone but decides meals and survives storms. Even teeth that wore down fast become a letter from a life. Hadrosaurs carried batteries of hundreds of teeth that ground plants into paste. The arrangement generated complex wear surfaces that self-sharpened, a living mill. A small iguanodont named Rhabdodon wore teeth that suggest browsing on tough shrubs. The shapes look strange in a museum until you picture them buried in leaves, shutting down a branch by branch. Geography multiplied the oddity, because different continents grew their own solutions. Cryolophosaurus wore a pompadour-like crest in Antarctica during a milder age. Muttaburrasaurus in Australia had a swollen snout that broadened the muzzle and probably carried soft tissues we can only guess at. Majungasaurus in Madagascar developed a heavy skull with ornamented ridges. Some of these looks were signals, some were structural, some were both. The deeper lesson is that evolution does not repeat a logo. It draws from a palette that includes climate, available food, and social lives, and it paints the same job with different strokes depending on place. The strangest dinosaurs also come to us as children and adults, so unlike one another that early workers mistook them for different species. Pachycephalosaurus and Dracorex and Stygomoloch are now commonly seen as growth stages of the same dome-headed animal. Horns soften into domes, skull bones fuse, ornaments change. Corythosaurus crests grow taller as air sacs and voice deepen. Mosaurus starts as a tiny hatchling and ends as a long-necked adult that walked differently as it grew. The shock is not that nature reuses bodies. It is that we failed to expect such change in a group we insisted was simple. If a climax is needed in this parade of oddity, it is not a single specimen but a moment when technology let us see plans we could not see before. LiDAR and drones mapped nesting grounds and trackways that show herd movement in sauropods. Straight lines of track that bend and merge like lanes of a highway. Computer models of airflow and hadrosaur crests predicted frequencies that match the carrying voices we imagined. Isotope tests on teeth showed that some animals migrated between lowlands and uplands seasonally. The papers look dense. The change they mark is simple. Strange is no longer an insult or a mystery. It is a signal that a life ran its business under rules that we can test with numbers as well as sketches. When you gather all these discoveries together, One truth rises like a crest at sunset. The dinosaurs were not a single idea repeated. They were a library of solutions, some elegant, some baroque, all specific. A claw as long as a forearm belongs as much to leaf pulling and defense as it does to fear. A sail can move water, a hump can bank fat, a crest can play a long, low note over a marsh. Membranes can glide where feathers flap, and feathers can insulate, display, and shade, even when they never touched wind. Oddity is what happens when we drop our expectations and read a body as a ledger of choices under pressure from food, rivals, weather, and time. Across all these discoveries, one pattern stands out. The strangest dinosaurs have a way of becoming ordinary once we add context. A giant with paddle tail, a little climber with skin wings, a grazer with a squared muzzle, a night runner with eyes like moons, a tank that still wore camouflage. Each looked impossible in a museum case until someone put them back into a forest, a river margin, a dune edge, a floodplain. There they settle, there they make sense. If they unsettle us now, it is a useful discomfort. It reminds us that our own picture of the world is probably too neat. Which of these dinosaurs surprised you most? The river hunter with a canoe body, the feathered glider with a membrane on its arm, the lawnmower sauropod with teeth like a conveyor belt, the armored giant painted to disappear. Tell us in the comments and share the oddest fossil fact you know. If you want more stories that replace easy drawings with living detail, subscribe, and we will follow the next strange track together.